Today, we're diving into a really fascinating story. It's about a border dispute, but not just any border. This one was drawn up by colonial empires and ended up being decided in the highest court in the world. This is the story of how a single line on a map set two of Africa's giants, Nigeria and Cameroon, on a collision course. And that really gets to the core question here, doesn't it? What actually happens when a border, drawn 100 years ago by people who likely never even set foot there, is suddenly disputed by modern independent nations? This isn't just a local issue. This kind of conflict tests the very foundations of international law, pitting those inherited colonial frontiers against the realities of national identity and sovereignty.
And look, we're not talking about some tiny little patch of land here. This border is massive. It stretches all the way from the sandy shores of Lake Chad down through mountains and forests and ends in these dense, resource-rich mangrove swamps on the Atlantic coast. So you can just imagine, with that much land and that much diversity, any fight over it was going to be incredibly complex and, well, fiercely contested.
So to really get a handle on this whole conflict, we've got to rewind the clock. Because the seeds of this dispute, they weren't sown by Nigerians or Cameroonians. Nope. They were planted by European powers, back when they were basically just carving up a continent for themselves.
Okay, so check out this timeline. The whole story is really just a century of colonial deal-making. It all kicks off in 1884, when Great Britain signs what they called a Treaty of Protection. Fast forward to 1913, and now Britain and Germany are literally drawing a line on a map. Then, after World War I, that German territory gets sliced up between the British and the French. So you can see what's happening, right? When Nigeria and Cameroon finally get their independence in the 60s, they're handed this messy, confusing legacy. And it's that legacy that ultimately sends them to court in 1994.
All right, so the stage is set for a massive legal showdown at the International Court of Justice. But this wasn't a battle fought with armies. This was a battle of lawyers, historians, and dusty 100-year-old documents. Let's break down what each side was arguing.
On one side, you had Cameroon. Their case was pretty straightforward, really. A deal is a deal. The colonial treaties are legally binding. It's a key principle of international law. You keep the borders you inherit. But Nigeria came back with a powerful counterargument. They said, hold on a second. Britain never actually had sovereignty to give away in the first place. To them, that 1884 treaty was just about protection, not a transfer of ownership. The logic was simple. Britain couldn't give away what it never truly owned, and besides, Nigeria's long-standing presence there made the land theirs.
So how did the court even begin to untangle this mess? Well, they didn't try to solve it all in one go. They broke the border down into sections, and they started at the very top, in the ecologically critical Lake Chad Basin. So for this Lake Chad region, the court sided firmly with the old colonial documents. They ruled that those papers had, in fact, established a valid boundary. But here's the most crucial takeaway. The court rejected Nigeria's argument that its long-term administration and the presence of its people gave it a valid claim. This ruling set a huge precedent. It basically said that a legal treaty on paper is more powerful than claims of on-the-ground control, a concept that lawyers call effectivités.
Now that ruling on Lake Chad, that was really just the warm-up act, because it set the stage for the most explosive, most emotional part of the dispute, the Bakassi Peninsula. This small piece of land, rich in oil and home to thousands, became the absolute symbol of the entire conflict.
This was the billion-dollar question. Nigeria's whole case for Bakassi pretty much rested on the idea that the 1884 Treaty of Protection they'd made with the kings and chiefs of Old Calabar was sacred, and that it couldn't just be undone by a later deal between two European powers.
To answer that, the court had to define what a treaty of protection actually meant back in the colonial era. And here's the thing, it wasn't an agreement between equals. The court found it established what's called a colonial protectorate, which meant the European power took control of all foreign relations, and that, critically, included the power to set borders.
So the crucial point is this. The court ruled that by signing that 1884 treaty, the local rulers had effectively given Great Britain the authority to act on their behalf on the world stage. This one interpretation was the legal key that unlocked the entire Bakassi dispute.
And that interpretation was absolutely decisive. The court's final vote wasn't even close. By a margin of 13-3, the judges sided with Cameroon.
So the final verdict was unambiguous. Because Britain had the authority under that colonial protectorate model, the 1913 border agreement with Germany was valid. And that agreement placed the Bakassi Peninsula squarely on the German and therefore later on the Cameroonian side of the line.
But wait, the court's job wasn't done. Borders don't just stop at the coast, right?
The dispute extended out into the Gulf of Guinea, where potential oil and gas reserves were at stake. So now, the court had to draw a line on the water.
And the court followed a very logical, step-by-step process. First, it honored agreements the two countries had already made, which took the boundary out to a spot called Point G. Then it applied the standard method, drawing a line that's equally distant from both coastlines. After that, it asked, is there any major geographical reason we should adjust this line? The court said no. Finally, it laid out the coordinates, creating a clear maritime border, all while being super careful not to step on the toes of their neighbor, Equatorial Guinea.
Okay, so the judgment was delivered, but a ruling on paper is one thing. Making it a reality on the ground is something else entirely. The court had to issue specific orders to both countries.
The orders were direct and they were reciprocal. Nigeria had to pull its entire state apparatus, its administration, military, and police out of the territories awarded to Cameroon. And Cameroon had to do the same for any small pockets of land that fell on Nigeria's side. This had to be done quickly and without any conditions. And crucially, the court rejected all claims for financial compensation, effectively wiping the slate clean.
And this gets to the human side of the ruling. Tens of thousands of Nigerians were living in these areas, so the court made a point of noting Cameroon's formal promise to protect the rights of those populations, to make sure that this territorial dispute wouldn't turn into a humanitarian crisis.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, this case sent a powerful message across the globe. It proved that even massive international disputes can be settled peacefully through law. And it reaffirmed a core, if sometimes controversial principle, that the borders drawn during the colonial era, for better or for worse, remain the bedrock of the modern international system.
So, the line on the map is now settled. But that leaves us with one final question, doesn't it? A legal judgment can define territory and sovereignty. Sure, but can it resolve the deep-seated feelings of identity and history that are tied to that land? Well, that's something only time and the people of Cameroon and Nigeria can answer.